Northeastern France, April the 20th, 1918. The skies above the Western Front are an arena of ferocious dogfighting between Allied and German aircraft. Among the players in this aerial duel is the legendary German ace, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Von Richthofen's distinctive red Fokker triplane is seen raking through the Somme Valley. In its sights, 2 British Sopwith Camels. First one, then the second, are swiftly eliminated by the deadly assassin. They are the 79th and 80th kills of his career. Now Kaiser Wilhelm is being pressed by the Baron's mother to withdraw his highest-scoring fighter pilot from the front line. In 2 days' time, Manfred von Richthofen is due to go home on leave, but fatefully, he has one more day of flying combat, a day that will end in mystery, controversy, and death. In March 1918, the Germans launch the Ludendorff offensive, their final effort to end the war. German troops and supplies pour into the valley of the Somme. To counter, British and Australian troops dig in on the high ground of the Moorland-Cour Ridge. In vital support, both sides use reconnaissance aircraft to spot what the enemy is doing. And both sides fly fighter squadrons to protect their reconnaissance missions. One fighter squadron is the famed Flying Circus, commanded by Manfred von Richthofen. It is brought up to the front. RAF 209 Squadron is Bond. One of its pilots is a Canadian, Captain Roy Brown. The stage is set for the aerial arms race of the First World War to climax in one fatal shootout. Manfred von Richthofen was born into minor Prussian nobility. His father was a cavalry officer. Young Manfred inherited the hunter's appetite and instinct.
He had a very happy youth. He was athletic, he was strong, he was joyful, and he very much liked shooting, riding, swimming, all what young boys do.
His destiny was certain. He would join the Imperial German Army, and his athleticism and horsemanship led him inexorably into the cavalry. When the Great War began, the traditional role for cavalry was reconnaissance. But a new war demanded new tactics. Stalemate across entrenched positions and miles of barbed wire impeded the movement of horse. Aircraft took on the vital role of spotting enemy trenches, artillery positions, and troop movements. They became the eyes and ears of battle.
They were scouting pilots, and of course there was some reticence from high command, especially from the old cavalry officers, that aircraft would be of any use whatsoever, and they were very much seen as something experimental, something fancy, and we'll stick with the tradition, thank you very much.
Little more than glorified kites, the early reconnaissance aircraft were fragile, underpowered, and unarmed. Carrying only their service revolvers, pilots took to the skies. The aerial arms race was about to begin.
As they tended to meet aircraft in the air more often, these pilots and observers decided to take upon themselves to have a pop. As a soldier, it was a natural thing to do, to try and shoot at your enemy, who, after all, is the opposing side and you are supposed to be killing.
Stranded in the cavalry, von Richthofen became fascinated by the exploits of the new Knights of the Air, young men taken to the skies to gather vital information for their ground forces below.
He got bored and he wanted to have a more exciting role in this war, and he thought to be trained as a pilot would take much too long time. He wanted to have it now, and therefore he was quite happy going in reconnaissance and bomber flights as a companion, but not as a pilot.
Von Richthofen transferred to the German Air Service, and by May 1915 was traveling to Cologne to join an observer flight training program. It was a shock.
I sat in an aeroplane for the first time. The blast of wind from the propeller disturbed me greatly. Everything flew away from me. My flying jacket slipped off, my muffler too loose. In short, I was miserable.
It was an unpromising debut. But von Richthofen continued his training. With his hunter's instinct, he knew that control of the skies would depend on good marksmanship. For both sides, protecting your own and preventing enemy reconnaissance now became a frantic race to get the machine gun into the air.
The major challenge was really to get enough power out of the aircraft. If you put a machine gun on it, you lost perhaps 1,000 feet in height, in working height, because of the extra weight. And that could be a matter of life or death. If the enemy pilot could get above you, it was quickly realized that he had the advantage.
A handful of young, ambitious pilots on both sides were now beginning to experiment. One of the innovators was Royal Flying Corps Captain Lano Hocker. In the spring of 1915, he mounted a Lewis gun on his Bristol Scout. Though it was difficult to aim off to one side of the propeller, Hocker successfully shot down 2 German aircraft and forced another to land. Hocker had fired the first salvo in an arms race that would soon pit him against von Richthofen in a mortal duel. Despite Hocker's efforts, most pilots and designers agreed that the attack was to aim head-on at the enemy. But theory was easier than practice.
They had to devise some means of firing a gun through the rotating propeller, rigidly fixed to the airplane so that it could be steered by steering the airplane. And of course the big problem was propeller avoidance.
The breakthrough came in the spring of 1915 with a young French aviator named Roland Garros. Garros had learned to fly in 1909, and his skill in the air had won him a string of pioneering air races. When war broke out, he was sent as a test pilot to the aircraft designer Raymond Saulnier. Saulnier was experimenting with a synchronization device that would allow a gun to fire through a rotating propeller, not hit it. But Saulnier was failing. Instead, he tried an alternative solution, attaching metal deflector wedges to the propeller blades of his Morane aircraft.
The idea being that when the machine gun fired, if a bullet hit the steel wedge, it would be deflected away from the wooden propeller. Sometimes it split the bullet, sometimes it came back at you, so this was gutsy stuff.
In February 1915, Garros intercepted a German reconnaissance aircraft. Within seconds, he sent it burning to the ground. The kill was followed by a run of victories. Roland Garros became the first fighter ace.
Garros absolutely confounded the Germans that this aeroplane coming towards them with the rotating propeller, they thought they were perfectly safe, and suddenly it started spouting bullets. So there was confusion in the ranks.
Garros's achievement was short-lived. Over enemy lines, he suffered engine failure and was forced to land. His captured aircraft with its deflector blades was sent to a young Dutch designer on the German payroll, Anthony Fokker. Unwittingly, Garros had handed the Germans the advantage. Fokker realized that the steel wedges were dangerous. What was needed was a mechanism linking the revolution of the propeller to the firing of the gun. In a matter of days, Fokker came up with his so-called interrupter gear, an engine-driven system which would only release a bullet from the gun when it would miss the propeller blades. For his German paymasters, Fokker had delivered the holy grail of the early air war, a synchronized forward-firing machine gun.
You could put the line of the gun close to the line of the airplane, directly in the pilot's eye view. So in the act of pointing his airplane at the target, he was effectively looking straight down the line of his gun.
By the autumn of 1915, the German Air Force had the upper hand. With their synchronized front firing, the fast Fokker Eindeckers were coming on stream, and ambitious young pilots were learning how to use them. Two of the deadliest were Max Immelmann and Oswald Boelcke.
Boelcke and Immelmann did begin to learn the language of aerial warfare. The aircraft wasn't that good, but it was reasonably maneuverable, reasonably fast, and best of all, it was great at diving, and that was what they actually used to devise some of the early fighter tactics.
Awestruck by the young German aces, Manfred von Richthofen was still stuck as a gunner in twin-engine bombers, but he wanted to become an aerial fighter like Boelcke. A chance encounter was about to change his life. On October the 1st, 1915, Manfred von Richthofen met by chance his idol, the Eindecker fighter ace, Oswald Boelcke.
Among us, Boelcke was the only one who'd shot down an enemy airman. I asked, "Tell me honestly, how do you really do it?" To which he laughed and replied, "Good heavens, it is indeed quite simple. I fly in as close as I can, take good aim, shoot, and then he falls down."
Von Richthofen saw his destiny. While von Richthofen learned to fly, Boelcke's colleague Max Immelmann were inventing fighter tactics, preying on reconnaissance aircraft. Pulling steeply out of an attacking dive, Immelmann would start a loop and stall turn his aircraft to begin a second attack. His audacious maneuver, the Immelmann turn, passed into flying folklore. Not to be outdone, Boelcke wrote a tactical rulebook that became the Bible for fighter pilots right into the Second World War.
Try to place yourself between the sun and the enemy. Attack when the enemy least expects it. Never turn your back and try to run. Foolish acts of bravery only bring death.
Boelcke was really the father of aerial tactics. The early years of the air war were the era of the lone hunters. You had aces in particular who would go up, hide in clouds, look for a lone victim, pounce, try and take them by surprise, and shoot them down.
Slow two-seater reconnaissance aircraft, like the BE-2C, were particularly vulnerable.
Beware of the Hun in the sun. The British really had a problem on their hands. They were being shot down to such an extent, actually, that the pilots were calling themselves Fokker fodder. It was having an effect on morale, and we really needed to come up with some idea of how to tackle this.
The British tried to respond. Brigadier General Hugh Trenchard, commander of the Royal Flying Corps, issued an order on the 16th of January, 1916.
Until the RFC are in possession of a machine as good as or better than the German Fokker, it must be a hard and fast rule that a machine proceeding on reconnaissance must be escorted by at least 3 other fighting machines. These machines must fly in close formation.
People realized that they had to work.
Greater safety in numbers gave the Allies a chance. But more aircraft in the skies brought an escalation of aerial combat, or dogfighting.
There's one rule really, which is to kill the other guy before he can kill you. And if you can see him before he can see you, then that's 90% of the battle over.
first half of 1916 witnessed the German offensive of Verdun. Then the Allied counteroffensive of the Somme. Epic, unrelenting slaughter that would haunt a generation. In the skies above, Manfred von Richthofen cut his teeth as a pilot, flying support sorties, first in a two-seater, then an Eindecker.
He was maybe not a talented flyer from the outset. He failed his first flying exam, but he was very quick in grasping the essentials and learned and enjoyed it. He once said it's wonderful to hunt from the air.
The Allies were delivering new dedicated fighter squadrons to the front. The DH-2, a so-called pusher aircraft, had the engine behind the pilot and a forward machine gun. It was fast and highly maneuverable. The Allies finally had a match for the German Eindeckers. The point was nailed home in June when dogfighting with DH-2s, Max Immelmann was killed. As the Battle of the Somme raged below, with aerial reconnaissance more vital than ever, the British finally delivered their own synchronized forward firing. The seesaw of aerial advantage had swung firmly back to the Allies.
In 1916, the British situation was radically transformed by two things. One, the arrival of new and better aircraft, the DH-2, the FE-2B, and the Sopwith 1.5 Strutter. So they had better planes. They also got a lot of them, and numbers are strength. And as a result, the Allies had an almost complete mastery of the air.
The Germans were on the defensive and needed a new plan. All eyes turned to their top ace, Oswald Boelcke.
People like Boelcke had the idea of forming dedicated fighter groups, the so-called Jastas, with the best pilots and the best machines, which would go off and hunt the Allied aircraft and could be concentrated on particular sectors of the front, so that even if the Germans were outnumbered overall, at the key point in the key times, they might have at least numerical parity, if not sometimes superiority.
Boelcke handpicked his pilots. One was the young man he'd inspired to become a fighter pilot, Manfred von Richthofen. Boelcke drilled his new protégés with his tactical principles. His Jasta II squadron quickly notched up victory upon victory. To von Richthofen, Boelcke became a mentor.
Boelcke was looking for aggressive, capable pilots with the killer instinct that really characterizes all successful fighter pilots. They needed to have the situational awareness to know what was going on around them in a dogfight. They needed to have good marksmanship. All those things I think he saw, particularly the marksmanship and the ruthlessness in von Richthofen.
Towards the end of 1916, the new Jastas were gaining the initiative. When Boelcke took charge of the fast, heavily armed new Albatros fighter in September, German air supremacy was regained. Boelcke doubled his score in the autumn to 40 victories. But ironically, at the height of his success, he was killed in a mid-air collision. His successor was then shot down by the British ace, Lano Hawker. The leadership vacuum was quickly filled by the rising star, Manfred von Richthofen. In just 2 months, with Jasta II, he had notched up his first 10 kills. Now, as its temporary leader, he took off in search of Hawker's DH-2 squadron, hell-bent on revenge.
The DH-2 is incredibly maneuverable, and Hawker obviously very talented. Richthofen had the advantage of speed and armament, so what then happened was a deadly game of tail chasing.
Both of us flying like madmen in a circle, first left, then right. I was acutely aware that I was not dealing with a beginner. Finally, escape by flying in a zigzag course. That gave me my chance. My opponent fell, shot through the head a mere 150 feet behind our line. Another few minutes, and he might have escaped.
Here, Manfred really found somebody who was matching him, and he was the lucky one because in the end he could bring him down, but he really respected his competence and talent.
Hawker, the daring British pioneer, was buried beside the wreckage of his aircraft. He was von Richthofen's 11th kill. A legend was in the making. On the 10th of January 1917, Manfred von Richthofen was appointed leader of his own Jastas squadron, number 11. Fast gaining a fearsome reputation, the new commander painted his albatross bright red. The legend of the Red Baron was born.
You needed to recognise each other, and it's from that that you start getting aircraft being painted either in squadron colours or in individual colours. And for Richthofen to actually paint his aircraft completely red, it did become a talisman.
Throughout the spring of 1917, the German Jastas wreaked havoc. Allied reconnaissance and air support for the Arras offensive below was annihilated in the skies. In the first week of April, the Royal Flying Corps lost 75 aircraft. Nicknamed Bloody April, the air war had become a particularly nasty business. Teenage RFC pilots were arriving at the front, often with as little as 18 hours flying time. They learned fast or died. The life expectancy of a new pilot in 1917 was a matter of weeks. Man for man, the proportion of those killed in action in the skies exceeded even the carnage in the trenches below.
In the whole month, down 362 Allied airplanes. Richthofen and his men and the chaps in other units, they created havoc at Arras in April 17. The Royal Flying Corps never had such serious losses. It was the worst month of the war for them.
In bloody April, Allied losses in the skies outnumbered the Germans by 4 to 1. Von Richthofen's personal tally was now 52 kills. He had overtaken his mentor, Boelcke, and was now the leading ace of the war.
It wasn't a game for Richthofen of sentiment. It was a matter of killing, of protecting his comrades on the ground. That's what he was doing it for. The British, of course, most of them hated him because he was good at his job. And the popular idea of him being a cold-blooded killer who was cowardly and not accepting straight fights but hiding behind his wingmen, that's an unfortunate inability to understand the reason why he was there and the nature of war.
He didn't mind having a kill which was completely defenseless. Indeed, he preferred it. He would tend to avoid combat where he perceived any risk, but he would go in when he thought he was able to achieve his kill. He would go in very, very close, and he would fill the enemy with lead.
The Allies were suffering the greater losses, but they managed to deliver new and successful aircraft to the front. The SE-5A was fast and climbed quickly. The Sopwith Camel was well armed and manoeuvrable. And the versatile two-seater Bristol could hold its own as a fighter. They all came on stream in the summer of 1917.
These aircraft were almost as good, if not better, than the Germans. There was an essential parity of technology in the sky. One British aircraft may have done something slightly better than another German aircraft, but it was swings and roundabouts. And from that time on, the war in the air was more about numbers.
Numbers would hit Germany hard. The Allied naval blockade was hurting. Unable to replace aircraft as quickly as his opponents, von Richthofen responded by combining Jastas squadrons into ever larger units. Mobile hunting squadrons that could be packed up and redeployed proved extremely effective. The famed flying circus had arrived. The Germans also had one final ace up their sleeve. Anthony Fokker, the designer, had been working on a revolutionary new fighter aircraft, the DR-1 triplane. In August 1917, he personally delivered it to von Richthofen.
It had tremendous advantages in maneuverability, and von Richthofen would have liked it for that, because he was able to fly it to its limit and make almost certain that nobody could ever get on his tail.
As the war entered its fourth year, the arms race for aerial supremacy and von Richthofen's skill as a pilot had reached their zeniths. War had turned fragile flying machines into high-powered, heavily armed fighter aircraft, and the skies above the Western Front had become the stage for the daily dance of death.
This is the era of the dogfight, and some pilots said actually that by 1918, if there weren't 60 aircraft involved, you couldn't call it a dogfight. Great swirling beehive of activity and danger in a box of air a mile square. Quite extraordinary sight to see.
Now, after the United States' entry into the war, there were American pilots too, flying British and French aircraft. Germany realized that the weight of American involvement would soon be decisive. If Britain and France were to be defeated, there was no time to lose. General Ludendorff's final offensive began in March 1918. To protect German reconnaissance and intercept British operations, von Richthofen's flying circus was ordered to Cappy Airfield in the Somme Valley. They were soon in action, and on Saturday, April the 20th, von Richthofen scored his 79th and 80th kills, shooting down 2 Sopwith Camels. Pressed by the Baron's mother, Kaiser Wilhelm now prepared to withdraw the hero of the German air service from the front. Billeted here at the small chateau at Cappy, von Richthofen was just 2 days from taking his leave. But fatefully, he has one more day of flying combat. The morning of Sunday, the 21st of April, 1918, was not unusual, except that the wind, which normally blew west to east, turned east to west. At 09:45 hours, the Baron took off at the head of a formation of 9 Fokker DR-1s. A little after 10:40, the squadron spot 5 Sopwith Camel fighters coming up from the south. They turned to face them. As the fighters come together at 10,000 feet, 2 pilots, 1 German, 1 Allied, are under strict instructions to remain above the fray. Von Richthofen is babysitting his young cousin Wolfram. Likewise, Wilfred May, a new recruit from Canada, has been ordered by Captain Roy Brown not to engage the enemy. As the main fight erupts, May eases away as instructed. But when he sees a tantalizingly close, the adrenaline takes hold and he decides to attack. The pilot is Wolfram von Richthofen. The danger is quickly seen by the hawkish eye of the Red Baron. For Wilfred May, the sight of the infamous red triplane is too much, and he disengages from the fight. Sensing his 81st victory, von Richthofen dives to get behind May.
Looks like one of ours, mate. It looks like a Jerry triplane. They're coming in really low. Get on the blower, call it in. Right.
Several eyewitnesses on the ground spot first one aircraft and then another dive out of the clouds. A moment later, a third aircraft is seen to leave the fight. It's Captain Brown, giving chase to protect his inexperienced recruit. Von Richthofen misjudges his opponent's speed and ends up some way behind. To catch up, he tricks May, taking aim with the right machine gun. May's inexperience shows. Zigzagging, he deprives the camel of its greatest virtue, speed. Desperate as von Richthofen closes in, May drops lower and lower over the Somme Canal. Over Vaux-sur-Somme, the convoy narrowly avoids disaster with the village church. Von Richthofen again takes aim with the right-hand machine gun and fires. But the gun jams, and May is reproved. Now, deep into Allied territory, ground gunners are trying to get the red triplane in their sights. Closing in from the southeast to make his attack, Captain Brown is pushing his aircraft to its limit. Ahead, the River Somme turns sharply to the south, below the steep bluff of the Morlancourt Ridge. May climbs the ridge, fearing at any moment the lead from the Baron's guns. Von Richthofen closes for the kill. But now, as the two aircraft climb the ridge, Captain Brown unleashes a long burst of fire from the southeast towards the tail of the triplane.
Yeah, I've got him. As soon as our man gets out of the way, we'll be okay.
On the back slope of the ridge, gunners Bowie and Evans also let rip with their Lewis machine gun. And just below the crest of the ridge, Sergeant Popkin, who has been following the fight, swings his Vickers machine gun into action. The red triplane breaks sharply northeast, stalls, and is seen to stagger to the ground in a field by the St. Colette brickworks. Manfred von Richthofen, the greatest ace of World War I, is dead, shot through the chest by a single .303 bullet. Why did Germany's master tactician break the rules, pursuing his quarry deep into enemy territory? And who really fired the fatal shot that brought him down? Why did Manfred von Richthofen break the rules and allow himself to become isolated deep and low in enemy territory? There was the crucial factor that the wind had changed direction. Instead of the normal west to east, it had turned east to west, and it carried von Richthofen over the Allied lines far more quickly than he anticipated.
It's very easy to get incredibly disorientated when you're that low down, because all your landmarks have gone. You can't see that village, you can't see that church spire, you can't see that enemy battery over there.
Von Richthofen is at fault in not watching behind, taking care of his own security as he usually did. It's a case of target fixation, and he's got tunnel vision focused exclusively on his target.
Manfred, of course, was a human being, and a human being is not without faults. And yes, he disobeyed his own rules for reasons which we do not know, which we cannot pursue nowadays, but he did, and he paid it with his life.
Von Richthofen's uncharacteristic errors have perplexed scholars. But above all, controversy continues over who brought him down. The kill was officially credited to Captain Roy Brown of RAF 209 Squadron. But was it truly Brown's bullets which ended the Baron's life? Von Richthofen's body was taken to Poulainville, where several medical examinations were carried out. They showed that he had been mortally wounded by a single .303 bullet that entered below the right armpit and passed through the chest, emerging just below the left nipple. The puzzle was that both Allied aircraft and ground gunners used the same .303 ammunition. The direction, distance, and timing of this fatal shot were vital clues that had never been satisfactorily explored. Starting from the medical reports, author and aviation historian Norman Franks has been reinvestigating the mystery.
Once we looked at the pathology, I interviewed 2 or 3 eminent pathologists, and they said that the sort of wound that he would have suffered would have given him no more than 12 to 20 seconds of life once he was hit. Just enough to get down.
I've asked a few pilots about this, those that were there, and one in particular, Rudolf Stack, a Bavarian, he was flying that morning, and he reckons that Richthofen was still alive when he landed, because he said the triplane was so touchy to fly, it was absolutely impossible for it to land smoothly on its own.
Wounded, had von Richthofen wrestled his aircraft safely to the ground? 80 years after the event, this question was finally answered by a startling new piece of evidence, a letter which arrived at London's Imperial War Museum.
Here was a letter sent in by Mr. Twycross telling us about a trip to France by him and his father in the early 1970s. The son didn't really know anything about the First World War. He was just taking his dad back to the battlefields, and they went to the Morlancourt Ridge, and suddenly the story came out that his father had actually been in the Royal Artillery in a forward observation post with his officer and had watched the whole of the Richthofen-Brown dogfight and had seen Richthofen's aircraft come down.
My father's officer sent my father down to take the pilot prisoner, which my father did. My father was the first man to the aircraft, and the pilot tried to say something in German to my father. The pilot then sighed and died.
This added a whole new dimension to the final moments of Richthofen's life and confirmed that the aircraft came down intact. It was practically flown down. Richthofen was still alive, which nobody had known about before.
With von Richthofen alive on the ground, the shooter must have fired at him just 20 seconds before he landed. Was Captain Brown close enough to have made the kill? A second new piece of evidence now emerged. It was a large collection of correspondence from the 1930s between a former World War II RAF officer, John Coltman, and surviving witnesses of the Baron's last flight. It had lain quietly undisturbed for 60 years.
What I found very quickly was that almost none of the original contributors to the Coltman papers had in fact been contacted by later authors, and therefore it was very fresh and very rewarding to look at it.
In the collection was a letter from an Australian engineer called Derbyshire, who was watching the action from the Somme Canal. Crucially, he was in a position to see both von Richthofen and Captain Brown.
Now, after the acid test, I turned to look at the two leading planes just going over the ridge, heard a burst of gunfire, and the Fokker stopped in its stride and did the first half of a loop, then straightened out and fluttered down out of sight as if doing a pancake landing. By this time, the third plane was just approaching the ridge. I was amazed later to hear that the Hun was brought down by a plane, as the chaser was not firing at the time the Germans stopped.
Derbyshire's statement was a vital clue.
He saw the triplane coming back over the ridge, rear up, and then crunch down in a forced landing. That, to us, indicated when he was hit, which was way past Brown's attack.
Allegedly, Captain Brown was pressed into claiming the victory, despite the fact that his own combat report was ambiguous as to whether he had made the final kill. When Coltman contacted him in the 1930s, he continued to evade the questions, protecting a reputation that perhaps he did not deserve.
There's no point by making any statement when official records are in existence.
Who did fire the fatal shot? From ballistics tests, we can evaluate the behavior of a bullet fired from different ranges.
3, 2, 1.
When a human body is hit, there's an explosive effect called hydrostatic shock. The closer the range, the greater the wound damage.
If the bullet had struck von Richthofen at close range, I would have expected a more explosive type wound. Now, the evidence is that the wounds were actually probed by the medical staff after he'd been shot down, and they were actually able to follow the bullet path through the body.
A low damage, low velocity hit would indicate a long range shot. Moreover, the .303 bullet that killed von was found.
The fact that the bullet was found intact inside the clothing of Richthofen is another indicator that it was a long-range shot. And I would say that would be probably 600 yards plus.
Yeah, I've got him. As soon as our man gets out of the way, we'll be okay.
On the reverse slope of the Moorland Core Ridge, Australian gunners Boelcke and Evans were in range and could have hit von Richthofen some 20 or 30 seconds before he is known to have died. When Coltman wrote to them in the 1930s, they remained convinced he was their kill. But von Richthofen was hit below the right armpit. Boelcke and Evans were firing face on to the triplane. They could not have hit him from the right-hand side.
So we asked our gun expert, what do we need to look at? He said, have you got somebody who knows what they're doing, 600 yards away, and he's firing at von Richthofen's right side? We said, yes. He said, there's your man.
Perched on the slope, Sergeant Cedric Popkin, 24th Machine Gun Company, had failed to hit von Richthofen as the chase hurtled towards the ridge. But he had swung his Vickers 180 degrees in case the red triplane reappeared. He was in luck.
In our view and final analysis, the best candidate for bringing down von Richthofen was Cedric Popkin, Australian Sergeant Machine Gunner.
Manfred von Richthofen was buried by the Allies on the 22nd of April 1918 with full military honours.
It is very sad and ironic that he was killed at the height of his competence and success. On the other hand, he would not have survived as a kind of symbol for chivalrous warfare as he has in being killed.
Manfred von Richthofen was revered not only because his 80 victories accounted for more enemy aircraft than any other fighter pilot in World War I, but because his life and death became a symbol of the aerial arms race of the Great War. In 4 years, aerial combat had evolved from an amateurish sport to a deadly, efficient killing operation. But now, the new evidence about von Richthofen's death reveals an extraordinary irony. The Red Baron never did lose a dogfight. He was killed in action by an old-fashioned gun from the ground.